Whose child is that? Gong Kyong's voice cut through the pediatric clinic's sterile silence like a blade, his squared shoulders tensing as he stepped toward the infant cradled against Diane's chest. Diane didn't flinch. She simply turned her body away, her protective stance creating a wall between the Mafia boss and the son he didn't know existed. Her ex-husband, the cold, authoritative head of a syndicate who had signed their divorce papers just 3 weeks ago to save his empire, looked like he'd been struck by lightning. 21 days divorced, a 3-week-old infant with a burning fever. The math was a bullet to his chest, shredding his polished professional composure in real time. He had chosen the survival of his blood-stained throne over their marriage, leaving Diane to face the end of her pregnancy and the birth of their child in a quiet, lonely apartment. He'd traded love for power. Now, this tiny, vulnerable life represented everything he'd thrown away, and the one thing his enemies could use to destroy him. As Diane's son let out a soft, pained whimper, she looked past the man in the expensive formal overcoat with a quiet, guarded strength. She realized they were both standing on the edge of a precipice. One word from her could either grant him the redemption he didn't deserve or leave him a king in a hollow, empty empire. Welcome back to the family you abandoned. Have you ever run into the person who broke you at the exact moment you were at your weakest? Not just any ex, the one who chose his business over your heartbeat and let you walk away without a single fight. Now imagine you're 21 days out from that divorce, holding your sick newborn, and the man who walked away is standing right in front of you. This story is a journey of fierce maternal love and a ruthless man's desperate search for redemption. It's about the high stakes of the Mafia world colliding with the fragile life of an innocent child. If you've ever wondered if a heart of stone can truly be broken by a tiny hand, you need to hear what happens next. Drop a comment below and tell me, if he walked away once, would you ever let him back in for the sake of the child? Don't forget to like and subscribe because the war for this family is about to get intense. The 21 days following the ink drying on the divorce papers felt less like a passage of time and more like a slow descent into an icy, silent purgatory. For Diane, the world had shrunk to the 4 walls of a modest apartment that lacked the gilded cage comforts of the penthouse she once shared with Gong Kyong. In that sprawling estate, silence had been a luxury, a reprieve from the heavy, unspoken weight of the syndicate's business. Now, the silence was a deafening reminder of everything she had lost and everything she had been forced to become. She was no longer the wife of a man whose name made the city tremble. She was a woman standing alone at the edge of a cliff, cradling a newborn whose very existence felt like a miracle and a tragedy rolled into one. The first week had been a blur of physical recovery and raw, jagged grief. Diane had moved through the rooms like a ghost, her natural, curly hair a tangled halo of neglect as she prioritized the infant's every whimper over her own needs. She remembered the way Gong Kyong had looked when he signed the papers, polished, sharp, and utterly unreachable in his dark suit, his eyes focused on the survival of his empire rather than the woman carrying his legacy. He had chosen the syndicate. He had chosen the old ways over the heartbeat of his own child, leaving Diane to deliver their son in a sterile city hospital with only a nurse to hold her hand. By the second week, the adrenaline of survival began to give way to a bone-deep exhaustion. The quiet strength that had always defined her started to feel like a heavy armor she wasn't sure she could keep wearing. Money was tight, and the transition from luxury to a modest, everyday life was a jarring reality check. She found herself counting the hours between feedings, her attention fully fixed on the baby, as she tried to ignore the unspoken tension that still thrummed in her chest whenever she thought of Kyong. She told herself she was fine. She told herself that 21 days was enough time to bury a love that had once felt like an entire world. But then, the baby's health began to decline. It started as a subtle fussiness, a refusal to latch that Diane initially attributed to her own stress. By the third week, however, the infant's light-colored clothing was damp with sweat, and his peaceful rest was replaced by a pained, rhythmic whimpering that tore at Diane's soul. A persistent fever took hold, turning the child's skin hot and flushed. Diane sat in the dim light of the nursery, her gray cardigan pulled tight around her as she rocked him, her face serious and focused with a resolve that bordered on desperation. Every time the fever spiked, the silence of the apartment felt more predatory, as if the walls were waiting for her to break. She was 21 days divorced, and for the first time, the weight of her responsibility felt like it might actually crush her. She had no one to call, no one to share the terror of a sick child with. Gong Kyong was a ghost, a man of emotional restraint who had traded this domestic struggle for the cold authority of his throne. As the baby's breathing became shallow and the fever refused to break, Diane realized that her guardedness was no longer a shield, it was a prison. She couldn't stay in the silence any longer. Driven by a fierce maternal instinct, she wrapped her son in a soft blanket and headed for the only place that could save him, unaware that the man who had abandoned her was already watching from the shadows. The modest hallway of the apartment building felt narrower than usual as Diane stepped out, her gray cardigan wrapped tightly around her chest, shielding the feverish bundle in her arms. Her baby's skin was a radiating heat against her, a silent alarm that drowned out the mundane sounds of the city waking up. She had lived these 21 days in a self-imposed exile, believing her quiet strength was enough to maintain the distance Gong Kyong had created when he signed those papers. But as she reached the lobby, a subtle tension shifted in the air, a familiar frequency she hadn't felt since she left the penthouse. It was the unspoken weight of authority, a cold shadow that didn't belong in this modest neighborhood. Through the glass doors, she saw them. They weren't hiding, yet they were invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. A black sedan was idling at the curb, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the pavement. Standing beside it was a man with neatly styled dark hair and a formal overcoat over a suit, signaling a world of power, distance, and control. His posture was alert, his shoulders squared but not relaxed, as he scanned the street with sharp facial features that mirrored the men who served her former husband. He wasn't just a passerby, he was a sentinel stationed in the path of her everyday life. Diane stopped, her grip on the baby tightening as her serious, focused gaze swept the perimeter, her body angled away from the threat. Across the street, another man in a similar suit stood near a newsstand, his wide eyes focused on her with an internal conflict that suggested he was processing something emotionally significant. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Gong Kyong had never truly let her walk away without a fight. He had simply moved the battlefield to her doorstep. While he remained a ruthless boss in his empire, he had cast the syndicate's shadow over her modest life, secretly monitoring her every move from the darkness. Her apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage surrounded by the very men who served the man who had abandoned her and their unborn child. This was the old ways of the Mafia, a world where love was treated like a vulnerability to be guarded or property to be watched with a polished, professional eye. Diane felt a flash of fury beneath her guardedness, a quiet strength pushing back against the emotional challenge of his distance. He had chosen the survival of his empire over their marriage, yet he refused to grant her the freedom she had paid for in heartbreak. The infant in her arms let out a shallow, pained whimper, his vulnerability a sharp contrast to the polished, authoritative men stationed on her doorstep. The baby's calmness in sleep was failing as the fever spiked, and the innocent child was caught between the emotional restraint of his father and the emotional responsibility of his mother. Diane knew she couldn't stay to argue with shadows. Every second she spent analyzing the syndicate's presence was a second her son's health slipped further away. She stepped onto the sidewalk, her posture protective and grounded, as she signaled for a taxi. The man by the sedan didn't move towards her, but his eyes followed her with an alertness that confirmed he was noticing something unexpected. Gong Kyong was watching. The math of the 21 days was coming to an end, and as the cab pulled away, Diane realized she was heading straight back into the heart of the storm she had tried so hard to escape. The steak on the porcelain plate was a cold, glistening monument to a life Diane had tried to leave behind exactly 21 days ago. Gong Kyong sat across from her in the sterile, private dining suite he had commandeered within the heart of the pediatric clinic, his presence radiating the sharp, authoritative edge of a man accustomed to absolute control over every soul in the city. He had discarded his dark, formal overcoat across a chair, revealing the tailored, professional lines of a suit that screamed of power and distance, a stark contrast to the quiet, clean hospital corridor visible through the heavy, half-open oak doors. Between them, resting in a high-tech portable bassinet he had doubtless commanded his men to fetch from across the city, their son was a small, fragile point of vulnerability in an environment designed for cold, high-stakes negotiations. He was dressed in light-colored clothing, resting peacefully for the first moment since the fever took its jagged hold, his innocence creating a jarring emotional contrast to the heavy, unspoken tension vibrating between the two adults. "I've set up a permanent trust in his name, and the penthouse is currently being remodeled to your exact specifications to ensure your comfort," Gong Kyong began, his voice low and composed, yet possessing a subtle tension that suggested he was emotionally unsettled beneath his polished surface. He leaned forward slightly, his shoulders squared but not relaxed, his wide eyes focused on Diane as if she were the most significant, unexpected revelation in his perfectly ordered empire. "The surveillance teams have been removed from the private living quarters entirely. I want you to come home, Diane. I want my son to grow up within the absolute protection of the dynasty I have built for him." He spoke of his legacy with a polished, professional tone, as if a child's safety and a mother's trust could be bought with the same ruthless efficiency he used to manage his syndicate. Diane didn't touch the wine he had poured. Instead, her hands remained firmly clasped over her lap, her posture protective and grounded, her body angled instinctively toward the bassinet rather than the man. She looked at the man who had signed their divorce papers just 3 weeks prior without offering a single word of fight, and all she saw was the emotional restraint that had once been an insurmountable wall between them. She was dressed in her soft gray cardigan, a visual signal of her everyday practical responsibility that clashed violently with his formal authoritative look. "You think this is simply about protection?" she asked, her voice carrying a quiet strength that made the expansive room feel suddenly smaller. "You don't think you can just buy back the 21 days you let me spend in pure terror, wondering if our son would survive the night alone in that apartment?" The baby stirred then, a small pained whimper breaking through the heavy silence of the room. Diane was on her feet instantly, her attention fully fixed on the infant, her face serious and focused as she cradled him securely to her chest, holding the child close to her heart. She didn't look at Gong Kyong as she continued to speak, her priority clear. "I won't be a Mafia wife again, Kyong. I won't raise a child in a world where he is viewed as a target before he can even crawl." She looked off to the side toward the hospital hallway, her expression one of caution and deep resolution rather than fear. Gong Kyong stood slowly, his posture alert, looking like a man who just noticed a challenge he couldn't overpower with money or threats. The physical distance between them, combined with their opposing gazes, created a canyon of unresolved history and revelation. He was a man of authority, challenged by a woman of responsibility, and as Diane turned toward the door, he realized that his empire was not enough to claim her heart. The sterile lights of the pediatric clinic dimmed as the city outside surrendered to midnight, leaving the room in a soft, heavy silence. Diane sat in the shadows of the corner chair, her gray cardigan pulled tightly around her as she watched the steady rise and fall of her son's chest. For the first time in 21 days, the harsh rhythmic gasping that had haunted her modest apartment had ceased. The fever had finally broken, leaving the infant in his light-colored clothing resting peacefully at last. Diane's face, usually serious and focused, was etched with a bone-deep weariness that even her quiet strength could no longer hide. Gong Kyong stood by the window, a statue of dark, formal lines against the pale glass. His dark overcoat was draped over a chair, but he remained squared and alert, his sharp facial features reflecting the quiet, clean environment of the ward. He had spent the last few hours in an emotional restraint that felt increasingly like a cage. His eyes, wide and focused, were not on the city empire he ruled, but on the small, vulnerable bundle in the plastic bassinet. "He's cooler now," Diane whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. She didn't look at him, her attention fully on the baby, but the unspoken tension between them was a tangible force in the small space. Gong Kyong stepped forward, his posture suggesting a man noticing something entirely unexpected, not a threat to his power, but a revelation of his own regret. He moved with a hesitation that betrayed his deep internal conflict. For a moment, the authoritative mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man who looked emotionally unsettled beneath his polished professional exterior. "Let me," he said, his voice rough and stripped of its usual command. Diane hesitated, her expression of caution and resolve, before she gently lifted the child and transferred the weight into Kyong's arms. As the baby nestled securely against his chest, the contrast was jarring. The smallness of the infant made Kyong's shoulders look too broad, his formal suit appearing too rigid for such a tender responsibility. The baby's calmness heightened the drama of the moment, a tiny life oblivious to the empire his father had prioritized over him just weeks ago. Kyong stared down at his son's face, and Diane watched as the cold, polished exterior finally cracked. In that quiet hospital corridor, nurture had finally challenged authority, and for the first time, Gong Kyong didn't look like a boss. He looked like a father who had realized exactly what he'd almost lost. The fragile peace of the pediatric clinic was shattered by the arrival of a single, unassuming package. A nurse approached the door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hospital corridor, holding a small box wrapped in paper the color of a bruised sky. Diane, still cradling her son securely against her gray cardigan, felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. Her protective stance was immediate, her body angling away from the door as her serious, focused gaze tracked the nurse's movement. Gong Kyong, who had been standing with his shoulders squared but not relaxed, moved with the lethal grace of a predator who had just sensed a trap. He intercepted the nurse before she could reach the bed, his sharp facial features tight with a subtle tension. He didn't speak, he simply took the package, his wide eyes focused and alert as he scanned the label. The formal dark overcoat he wore felt suddenly like armor in this place of care and vulnerability. Inside the box lay a silver rattle, intricate and cold, accompanied by a card with no name, only a date, the day of their divorce, 21 days ago. The message written inside was brief and lethal. Even the most precious legacy is vulnerable when it stands outside the walls of the fortress. The silence that followed was heavy with the unspoken tension of a revelation. The math was simple and devastating. While Gong Kyong had been mourning his lost marriage, his enemies had been counting the days of Diane's isolation. The divorce hadn't granted her freedom. It had painted a target on her back, and the innocent infant nestled in her arms. "They were watching the apartment," Diane whispered, her voice carrying a quiet strength despite the terror blooming in her chest. She looked at Gong Kyong, seeing the deep internal conflict in his face as he realized his emotional restraint had nearly cost him everything. The baby remained peacefully asleep, a strong visual of innocence in a world governed by power and threats. But Gong Kyong's face was now a mask of controlled fury. He realized that his enemies didn't care about their legal papers or his attempts at distance. To the syndicate, Diane and the baby were his only true vulnerability, and the hunt had officially begun. The armored motorcade was a cold iron reality that Diane could no longer refuse. As they crossed the threshold of the luxury penthouse she had fled only 21 days ago, the expansive rooms felt less like a home and more like a gilded fortress. The polished floors still reflected the museum-like wealth that Gong Kyong prioritized, but the air now hummed with a different frequency, one of high-stakes alertness and unspoken tension. Diane stepped into the center of the living room, her posture protective and grounded as she cradled her son securely against her gray cardigan. Even within these walls, she moved with a caution that signaled her quiet strength had not been broken by his sudden reappearance. Her face remained serious and focused, looking toward the newly remodeled nursery rather than engaging with the man who had once let her walk away without a fight. Gong Kyong stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his shoulders squared but not relaxed as he watched her. He had discarded his formal overcoat, but his sharp facial features were still tight with a subtle tension, mirroring the internal conflict of a man trying to reclaim a family he had previously abandoned for his empire. He looked composed on the outside, yet the way his wide eyes followed the baby's every movement suggested he was emotionally unsettled beneath his professional exterior. The security detail is stationed at every entrance. No one enters this floor without my personal clearance. You and the baby are safe here. Diane didn't turn to face him. Her attention was fully on the baby, her stance angled away to maintain the emotional distance she had cultivated during their 3 weeks apart. She was here because the silver rattle had proven her modest apartment was a target, not because she had forgiven the man who chose a syndicate over her heartbeat. "I am here for his safety, Kyong," she said, her voice a fragile yet firm thread of resolution. "Do not mistake my presence for a return to the way things were. You are his protector now, but you are not my husband." The physical distance between them, combined with their opposing gazes, created a canyon that no amount of Mafia power could bridge. Gong Kyong remained a king in his empire, but as Diane disappeared into the nursery, he realized that while he held them in protective custody, he was the one truly locked out. The silence of the pediatric ward was a fragile glass that shattered when the first elevator chime was followed not by soft footsteps, but by the heavy, metallic caulking of a weapon. Gong Kyong was across the threshold in an instant, his sharp facial features tight with a sudden, fierce alertness. He stood in the quiet hospital corridor, shoulders squared but not relaxed, his dark formal overcoat swirling as he prepared to face the threat. This was the brewing war within the syndicate he had feared, a coup led by men who saw his 21-day obsession with Diane as a fatal softness to be exploited. Inside the nursery, Diane stood grounded and protective, cradling the baby securely against her chest. Her face was serious and focused, looking toward the door with a quiet strength that refused to surrender to fear. The baby, nestled safely in her arms and dressed in light-colored clothing, remained a peaceful contrast to the violence erupting just feet away, a strong visual of innocence under threat. To the men storming the hallway, this infant was merely a vulnerability, a target to prove that Gong Kyong was no longer fit to lead his empire. "Get to the back. Don't open the door for anyone but me." Gong Kyong's voice was no longer a polished, professional command. It was the raw, desperate roar of a man whose whole world was at stake. He met the first wave of assailants at the doorway, his wide eyes focused with a lethal intent that had nothing to do with Mafia politics and everything to do with the child resting safely behind him. This was the biggest moment of tension, where the formal authority of a boss collided with the primal responsibility of a father. The corridor became a battlefield of authority versus nurture. Gong Kyong didn't retreat. He stood like a sentinel, his formal attire contrasting sharply with the emotional weight of the scene as his control was challenged. Diane held her son close, her heart pounding against his back, realizing that for the first time, Gong Kyong was not fighting for his throne. He was willing to burn his legacy to the ground to keep them safe. As the last of the attackers fell back and the unspoken tension of the coup began to bleed out, Gong Kyong Kyong leaned against the nursery door, breathless and emotionally unsettled, finally choosing his son over his empire. The air in the obsidian-paneled boardroom of the syndicate headquarters was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the cold, vibrating weight of authority. Gong Kyong stood at the head of the massive table, his shoulders squared but not relaxed, his dark, formal overcoat draped over his suit like a heavy mantle of the power he was about to discard. He looked every inch the polished and professional mafia boss, yet his sharp facial features were tight with a subtle tension that betrayed the deep internal conflict raging within him. For 21 days, he had been a man caught between the survival of his empire and the heartbeat of the family he had abandoned. Today, he was here to choose love over his blood-stained throne. He looked at the gathered heads of the syndicate, men who had known him only as a cold, ruthless leader who put the dynasty above all else. His wide eyes were focused and intense as he dropped a thick stack of legal documents onto the table, each one a nail in the coffin of his illegal operations. As of this moment, the syndicate's shadow over this city ends, he began, his voice carrying an emotional weight that cut through the professional restraint of the room. He was publicly dismantling the very throne he had traded his marriage for, rejecting the old ways to ensure a safe future for the sick child he had almost lost. He appeared emotionally unsettled beneath his composed exterior, but his resolve was as sharp as his features. He was no longer the man who signed divorce papers without fighting back. He was a man burning his empire to become a father. Back at the penthouse, the silence was no longer a cage of isolation, but a sanctuary of growing, fragile hope. Diane sat in the nursery, her natural, curly hair pulled back loosely as she held their son securely against her chest. She wore her gray cardigan over her casual top, a visual contrast of nurture and responsibility that stood in stark opposition to the cold authority Gong Kyong was currently facing. The baby, nestled safely in her arms and dressed in light-colored clothing, remained a peaceful contrast to the tension in the room, his very existence the reason for the high-stakes standoff occurring miles away. Diane's face was serious and focused, her expression one of caution and resolve rather than fear, as she waited for word of the syndicate's fate. She knew that if Gong Kyong failed to dismantle his throne, their son would forever be a target, a vulnerability that dangerous people would exploit. Gong Kyong's transition was a violent and public rejection of the Mafia's legacy. He faced the open rebellion of his rivals with an alertness that suggested he had finally noticed what was truly significant. He was no longer the boss making million-dollar decisions on 3 hours of sleep. He was a man making a choice to protect the innocent child currently asleep in a nursery. This was his final transformation, a rejection of the syndicate's power in favor of the emotional responsibility Diane had always embodied. He was systematically stripping himself of his power as penance for his cruelty, proving that he meant it when he said he would spend the rest of his life earning back her trust. As the sun set, the throne was officially broken. Gong Kyong returned to the penthouse, his formal attire dusty and his posture suggesting a man who survived a battle of the soul. He found Diane in the doorway of the nursery, her posture protective and grounded as she watched him. The physical distance between them was still vast, and their opposing gazes still held the weight of 21 days of silence, but for the first time, the unspoken tension between them felt like it could lead to a shared future. He looked at the baby asleep in her arms, the miracle that had changed everything, and his sharp features finally softened. He had traded an empire for this moment, a second chance to prove that love was worth risking his heart for. The 5 years that followed the shattering of the syndicate felt like a slow, golden awakening, a stark contrast to the icy purgatory of the 21 days that had once threatened to consume them. Gong Kyong stood on the sun-drenched deck of their coastal home, his sharp facial features finally free of the subtle tension that had been his permanent mask during his years as a ruthless boss. He no longer wore the dark, formal overcoat that signaled power and distance. Instead, he was dressed in a soft linen shirt, his shoulders squared but finally, truly relaxed as he watched the horizon. He was a man who had successfully transitioned his family's legacy onto a legitimate path, cutting the final ties to the old alliances and the corruption that had once been his only world. He turned as he heard the screen door slide open, and Diane stepped out to join him. Her natural curly hair was pulled back loosely, catching the light of the setting sun, and though she still wore a cardigan against the ocean breeze, the protective guardedness that had once defined her was gone. Her quiet strength, once a shield used to maintain emotional distance in a clean, quiet hospital corridor, had become the warm foundation of their home. She no longer looked off to the side with caution. Instead, she met Kyong's gaze with a resolve that was now rooted in trust rather than survival. Between them, their son, the infant who had once whimpered with fever in a modest apartment, was now a vibrant 5-year-old named Kai. He was running across the grass in light-colored clothing, his laughter a strong visual of the innocence and protection Diane had fought so hard to secure. Kai was the victory they had built from the ashes of a broken marriage, the reason Gong Kyong had been willing to burn his empire to the ground. Every time Kyong held his son, the contrast between his previous life of authority and his current life of nurture was a jarring, beautiful reminder of the transformation he had undergone. Their second wedding, held on this very beach 3 years ago, had been the final rejection of the Mafia wife life Diane had once refused. It had been a ceremony of choice, not obligation, where the only people who mattered were the three of them and the life they were building together. Gong Kyong had spent every day since the divorce papers were signed proving that he was more than a boss. He was a man who had learned that true power lay in the emotional responsibility of being a father and a husband. As the sun dipped below the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Kyong reached out and took Diane's hand. The physical distance that had once felt like a canyon in a pediatric clinic was gone, replaced by an unbreakable bond. They were far from the syndicate's reach, living a life that was quiet, real, and entirely theirs. Gong Kyong looked at his wife and son, realizing that while his old empire was gone, he had finally found the only kingdom worth ruling.